Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jackie Anderson, and I'm an assistant dean at the University of St. Thomas, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our weekly summer online learning series. Thanks for joining us. Today's session is 12 Trends of Living and Working with Don MacPherson. Now, it's hard to believe that this is the final session of our summer series. As you may recall, we converted our monthly online learning series to a weekly series during this crazy time of COVID. Our main goal was to provide you with free, weekly, relevant professional development, and we hope we've accomplished that goal. Now, seeing that this is the end of our summer weekly series, we're going to be sending out a survey next week, and I hope you participate. Whether you have participated in 1 or 21 of these sessions, we really want your feedback. It's important to us as we continue to evolve the series. Now, we're going to be moving back to our monthly format starting in September, and we've got a great start to the series. But based on some of our learnings this summer, we're going to hold one of the monthly sessions open for a wildcard session, meaning based on what emerging trends might be happening or feedback from the survey, we will adapt the last session to be basically viewer on demand. So with that, in September, we're going to kick off our fall series with Adam Dins. Now, Adam actually teaches in our digital marketing program here at the University of St. Thomas, and he will lead a session for our online learning series titled How to Move Ahead Without Losing Your Ahead. Now, Adam is a marketing guru, and he is also the author of a book titled Hopeful to Hired. He's a hypnotherapist and a veteran of the U.S. Navy. It's going to be a great session. And then in October, we're joined by a regular favorite, Peter Krems. Peter teaches in our leadership and management program, and his session will focus on the leadership adjustment that happens with this abundance of virtual connections that we're all having right now. And then in November, University of St. Thomas professor Mike Devon, he's actually the faculty director for our mini MBA program. He'll be leading a session around how the pandemic might be revealing certain aspects of our businesses, weaknesses and strengths. So it should be a great one. And then in December, as I mentioned, it will be our wildcard session. We hope to see you this fall. So let's get on to today's main event. In a moment, I'm going to hand over the digital platform to our speaker, Don MacPherson. Now, as always, please remember to use the chat feature to ask any questions during the session, and just address them to all panelists, and I will moderate a Q&A towards the end of the session. As always, our goal is to end no later than 8:55, and if for any reason you need to step away or you're having technical difficulties, don't worry, we're recording the session and we'll send out the link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. So with that, for our capstone event for our weekly online learning series, we have Don MacPherson. Now, Don is the executive director of Think to Perform Research Institute. It's an organization that's been dedicated to advancing moral, purposeful, and emotionally intelligent leadership. Don is also the host of the 12 Geniuses podcast, and he's a 5-time entrepreneur and has spent the last 25 years researching the employee and the customer experience. But probably most important to Don is his work with Big Brothers, and he's also the co-founder of the Inner City Ducks, an organization working with 100 athletes in the Camden neighborhood of North Minneapolis. Don is a great friend of the University of St. Thomas. It is my pleasure to introduce our capstone speaker, Don MacPherson.
Thank you, Jackie. Well, we have about 45 minutes together, and we're going to talk about a dozen trends that are redefining work and what it means to be human. And these are by no means a definitive list of technologies or trends that will shape the 2020s, but they are 12 of the ones that I've been following for some time and will be following over the next decade. And I think before we get started, it's important to acknowledge some of the trends from the last decade. Social and mobile technologies have really been a game changer for just about everybody around the world. Billions of people have now access to the internet in ways in which they didn't. In a mobile way, have a way to publish content that wasn't existing, 15 years ago. So those trends have been huge game changers over the last decade. From a social perspective, gay marriage, trans rights, corporate social responsibility, demands for alternative energy, and online shopping have been among the trends that we saw in the last decade. But those trends are just a blip in comparison to what we're going to see in the 2020s. So as Jackie said, my name is Don MacPherson. We'll examine these trends together. Looking at these trends will give you a better opportunity to prepare yourself personally and professionally to lead through change. As Jackie said, I'm a 5-time entrepreneur. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. You can contact me here, but as I was saying, I'm a 5-time entrepreneur. And now I'm spending my time divided between 4 different organizations. The first organization is called Harmony Foundation. Harmony Foundation is where I'm a board member. It's a drug and alcohol treatment facility in Estes Park, Colorado. I am the executive director as of July 1st of Think to Perform Research Institute, which incidentally was co-founded by one of your previous speakers, man by the name of Doug Lennox. We are advancing moral, purposeful, and emotionally intelligent leadership research and funding that research through our nonprofit, the Research Institute. And as Jackie had mentioned, for 27 years, I've been mentoring African American youth in the Twin Cities here. It started at Hennepin County Juvenile Detention Center. And then in 2003, I got an opportunity to meet Shaquille Nelson, who was has been my little brother for 17 years. He's 26. And last April, he asked me if I would be interested in co-founding the Inner City Ducks with him. We started with a very small team of 13 football players for spring football. By May, we were 30 people, and when COVID shut us down in March, we were 100. And I'm happy to say that we've resumed fall practice again, and we're well over 100 people, and we're going to have a great event tomorrow night in North Minneapolis celebrating Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It's the 57th anniversary. And most of my time is spent on the 12 Geniuses podcast, where I get to go around the world and interview geniuses about some of these trends that we're going to explore today. And it's an amazing opportunity to get access to incredible researchers, doctors, athletes, entertainers, and talk about the trends that are shaping the way we live and work. And for those of you who are interested in the podcast, you can find out more at 12geniuses.com. That's where you can sign up to the podcast. When I sold my software company that I had founded in 1999 with my business partners, we sold it in 2016. We built it up over the course of 17 years. After I sold the company to Aon, we all worked for the company for a couple of years, and it became evident to me once I left Aon in 2018 that the world had changed, and I was really intent on examining how it had changed, and that's why I started the podcast. And so we'll look at 6 technology trends today and 6 social trends. And I ask you, before we jump into the technology trends, to think about 4 different questions. Ask yourself 4 different questions. How does this change affect me? How does it affect my team? How does it affect my organization? And how will it affect my industry, or our industry? And think about it from an opportunity perspective and from a risk mitigation or disruption avoidance perspective. I think if you think about these technologies in that way, you're going to get great benefit from this conversation today. The first technology that we're going to look at, and incidentally, I should mention that all of these technologies that we're going to talk about today exist today and are out in the field today, being used today, but they will increase in importance over the course of this decade. The first one we'll look at is augmented reality and virtual reality. So surprisingly to me, as we were researching this, 50% of Americans are using augmented reality without even knowing it. So if you are using Instagram filters or Snapchat filters, that's augmented reality. You are augmenting reality. When you're watching an NFL or college football game and you see this yellow line on the screen, that is augmented reality. Or if somebody's drawing up a play, a basketball play or something like that, that's augmented reality. One of the really fascinating uses of virtual reality that we've come across is being done by Cedars-Sinai Hospital. And they're using it for pain reduction. And they found that people who are using virtual reality goggles and are immersing themselves in some sort of activity using the VR goggle have found that their pain has been reduced by 24%. There are all sorts of workplace applications we're going to find using VR and AR. Many of us are working virtually, and Zoom calls and conference calls are the norm. But in the future, we're going to see VR as being a way to meet virtually, but having a higher degree, a much higher degree of intimacy. We're also going to see these real-world assistants using contact lenses or glasses that will give us information as we're training for something or working on something, giving us real-time direction. We've highlighted Morgan Mercer on this slide. She was a guest on the podcast, and she runs a company called Vantage Point Software. And what Vantage Point does is offer sexual harassment avoidance training. And I actually had an opportunity to go through the demo. And so you sit there, you put on these VR glasses and a set of headphones, and after about 30 seconds, the weight of the headset goes away, and you become immersed, and you start watching two colleagues talking to each other, and you start to get uncomfortable as one of them is kind of violating the other person's space. There are all going to be all sorts of training opportunities. Think about bias training and racial tolerance training that could be used from this particular platform. There's also something called a full body haptic suit, which is used along with the VR goggles. So you put this full body suit on, and it stimulates the body based on what's going on in the situation that you're living through with the VR goggles. And so this could be used for training police officers and firefighters. It could be training somebody who is potentially going to be subject to interrogation. There are all sorts of really interesting uses for AR and VR. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is an application that I found quite interesting, and you can find it on YouTube. It's a woman who is in hospice. She was born in Israel, and she's living in the United States. And she was very anxious about her death. And she wanted to go home one last time. And they actually brought her home to her through VR. And they brought her back to Israel using these goggles. And there was a sense of peace that came over her. I highly encourage you, if you're interested in this particular technology and that particular story, to watch that video, because that level of calm that was provided to her was quite moving and quite incredible. At Harmony Foundation, where I am serving as a board member for that drug and alcohol addiction facility, we are experimenting with VR to help some of our incoming clients. And so there are all sorts of practical applications that we will see in the future, and even currently using AR and VR. And the last thing that I'll say about that before we jump to cybersecurity is this technology is in its infancy. We are going to see amazing strides over the coming decade. So the second technology is cybersecurity. And of course, this has been around a long time, but it's going to become increasingly important over the coming decade. 127 new devices are connected to the internet every second. That's 11 million a day and 4 billion a year. There were 2.6 million malware threats recorded in 2019. And if you go back to 2017, there were two really striking cybersecurity breaches that we can talk about. Equifax was hacked when the announcement came out in September of 2017. They lost $5 billion in their market cap. A third of their organization's value was wiped off the table from that one data breach. Now, it was 140 million people who had their data compromised, but that is an incredible liability for organizations. The other one was a ransomware attack called WannaCry. There were 16 hospitals in the UK that were shut down. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected in over 100 countries. So there's incredible liability there. And the more devices we have connected to the internet, the more outdated devices there become and the more vulnerable we become. Wars are being fought over the internet right now. So this is much like the Cold War was back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where we're fighting cybersecurity battles with China, with Russia, with Iran, other countries. And we're actually doing an episode on the future of war with the senior enlisted officer of U.S. Space Command, who was also the senior enlisted officer of the U.S. Marine Corps. And we're going to talk about cybersecurity. He was head of cybersecurity for the Marines, and he was an NSA liaison. So this trend in technology will become more important as the years go by. Max Heinemeyer is a threat hunter for a company called Darktrace, and Darktrace has an ominous sounding name, but he actually is one of those do-good hackers who protects us. He says that it's really important to do some simple things like manage our passwords and retire our old devices. And he's talking about super secure passwords that might have 3 or 4 words and then multiple symbols, a number of letters in it. We just can't be secure enough with our devices because there's so much liability from a personal perspective or from a financial perspective and so much risk for our organizations. So that's a trend that we're watching very closely. The third one is carbon capture. And in software, there's a term called technical debt. That's when you invest too much on a particular thing, like maybe a software feature, and you don't invest in infrastructure or things that are going to keep you running at a high level. And we globally have a carbon debt. So we're putting this is an amazing statistic, nearly 3 million pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every second. So we are eventually going to have to take that out. And the interesting thing is there are all sorts of innovations that are working in this direction. The first innovation is around sequestration. So that's actually taking carbon out of the air through technology and putting it back underground or into the ground. And a local company here, Cargill, is stepping up its global sustainability initiatives. And they have a goal of reducing supply chain emissions by 30% by 2030. So they're dedicating resources to regenerative agricultural practices and paying farmers to take and sequester carbon dioxide. One of the big obstacles to carbon sequestration is who will pay for it and how. So that is something that we have to solve as we look to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But another innovation is carbon capture and utilization. And we've got displayed here Mehrdad Mahutian, who on his PhD program, he was looking for a way to create cheaper and stronger concrete. And what he identified is a way to take carbon out of the atmosphere and use it as a binding agent to create concrete. And he's developed through his company Carbocrete a way to manufacture concrete that is carbon negative. So it actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's less carbon in the atmosphere after the concrete manufacturing process, which is absolutely stunning. So if every concrete manufacturer adopted Mehrdad's practice and principle or process, bottom line, we'd be able to wipe off 5% of global carbon emissions, because that is how much concrete and cement making creates in terms of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So that is one that we will watch, and it's really important that we start to pay down our carbon debt. And you're hearing more organizations like Microsoft and Amazon making that part of their value proposition and part of their branding initiative and advertising initiatives. The other thing that I'll say about carbon capture is, like solar and wind energy, carbon capture is starting out very expensive, particularly carbon sequestration, but we'll see the costs start to decline as innovations continue, just like with wind and with solar. The fourth technology innovation is biotech. And amazingly, there are over 2,000 tests available to doctors to test for genetic disorders. And these are pretty large categories. So there are subcategories within biotechnology that I'll talk about here. The first is biosensors. So there's a vest monitor that tracks fluid in a patient's lungs. So somebody who's experienced heart failure, they can track how much fluid is in somebody's lungs. And if it goes over a certain point, these biosensors will send an alert to a doctor or to a hospital and intervene with that particular patient. One that I'm really excited about is 3D bioprinting. So we have the ability now to print organs, cartilage, heart valves, skin. It's absolutely amazing. This new technology, this new capability, and this will again get cheaper, have greater adoption. The reason I'm particularly interested in this is I'm a hip replacement candidate. And so the idea of 3D printing cartilage or inserting stem cells and having cartilage grown again and skipping over the hip replacement is absolutely stunning. So I'm actually holding out and hoping that over the next 5 or 10 years, that is a possibility for me. Another one that's really exciting is bioplastics. So 13 million tons of plastic ends up in our oceans every year. And there are new technologies that are experimenting with replacing plastic with organic materials that function much like plastic, but eventually biodegrade much, much faster than obviously plastics do. And then the last one I'll talk about here is gene editing, using CRISPR for curing diseases. And we had on the podcast a gentleman by the name of Hank Greeley, who's an ethicist and lawyer from Stanford University. And he talked about how in the future, and he thinks over the next 20 or 30 years, that humans will no longer have sex to reproduce. That will not be the main way that we create babies, which is absolutely amazing. And he talked about something called PGD, which is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you're able to create sperm and eggs from stem cells. That's another treatment capability, which is really fascinating, because if you are able to create sperm and eggs from stem cells, it's possible where same-sex couples could have their own biological children. So we're going to see great advances along the lines of biotechnology. We've seen it in the past. What it does raise is some huge ethical questions, and that's why we wanted to have Hank on the show, is because theoretically, if you're able to take skin cells and then separate stem cells from those skin cells and create an egg or create sperm, in theory, you could take somebody's cells while they're sleeping and go through this process. Now that's in theory. There are huge ethical implications to that, and we even saw this play out in China last year, where a Chinese doctor, edited the embryos of that were implanted in 2 women, and one of the women had twins, and the doctor had edited the embryos so the children would be resistant to contracting HIV. Well, that doctor in China was put into prison for doing that. There's a huge outcry from the medical community because he had done that. But as we saw with stem cell research 20 years ago or more, human beings have come around to that and are willing to and see the benefits to exploring some of these biotech capabilities. Now this next one here, I think it's really important that maybe you just look away from the PowerPoint and look in my eyes for a moment, because I would be lying to you if I said I completely understand this one. But I have read enough from people I trust to know that this is going to be a game changer. Quantum is absolutely confusing and confounding to me, but I am fascinated by the potential capabilities. So just to kind of give what I understand of it, a quick overview of traditional computing versus quantum computing. Conventional computers use binary bits, so ones and zeros, and I think most of us are familiar with that. But quantum computing, they use quantum bits, also known as qubits, which can exist in both states, a 1 and a 0, simultaneously, as well as many other states in between. Now, we probably don't really need to understand how it works. There are a lot of technologies that we don't know how they work, but we know how to use them. And computer scientists have been working on quantum computing for a long time, but they believe that in the future it's possible that harnessing these mechanisms and building computers using quantum mechanics will result in computers millions of times faster than what we are experiencing today. And so some of the outcomes of that are pretty amazing. Having more efficient products, from new materials in batteries for electric cars, or better and cheaper drugs, vastly improved solar panels. And some scientists believe that quantum computing and quantum mechanics can be an answer for finding a cure for Alzheimer's. The big technology companies like Google, like IBM, they are investing in quantum in pretty dramatic ways. And Google is using it already to improve the software of self-driving cars. And the three last technologies that we're going to talk about, so biotech, quantum, and AI, were all identified by futurist. She's a local futurist, Cecily Summers. She said these are by far the three technologies that will change the way we work, but also what it means to be human. And so the last of these three is artificial intelligence. And back in 2013, I can remember doing a presentation like this with my business partner, Patrick Riley. And one of the slides that we presented was that by 2013, 90% of the data that had ever been created had been created in 2011 and 2012. So there's exponential amounts of data being created, which is absolutely phenomenal. The same can be said in 2020. So in January of 2020, you could make the statement that 90% of the world's data that had ever been created were created in 2018 and 2019. Artificial intelligence thrives in an environment where there's a ton of data. Now, how does this play out? China is a place where there is an enormous amount of data, not just because it has 1.4 billion citizens, but because of the way that the government and technologies that are available in China are capturing data and making that data available. So what's happening in China right now is that every citizen is subject to a score, a personal score. Their score is based on video watching, purchasing history, other sources of behavioral data. And the score will be used to determine that individual's ability to own property, be allowed on an airplane, have access to high-speed internet, get a loan, and more. So just think about that for a second and think how, to me, it makes me very uncomfortable, and maybe it makes you uncomfortable as well. This use of AI for tracking raises questions, ethical questions, obviously. We're not there yet in the United States. We have much more privacy, but 48% of job seekers, according to ZipRecruiter, were worried that AI is going to eliminate jobs. And ZipRecruiter says that AI is actually creating jobs. I believe personally, and from the many experts that I've talked to, that AI is a tool, and the more that we can harness it, the more effective we're going to be in our jobs. But it does elevate a number of different characteristics. So like things like emotional intelligence or unique problem solving, and living in an ethical society where just because we have data on people, we're not using it in a malicious or a manipulative way. And so there is incredible power in AI, but there is an incredible responsibility as well. Ben Waber was a guest on the show. He runs a company called Humanize. He was one of the founders. He's actually a product of MIT's Media Lab. And one interesting story that we talked about. So what Humanize does is it captures data about employees for their clients, but also uses existing data like time tracking or geolocation if you're badging in and out of the different parts of a building, etc. Email activity, maybe using natural language processing to analyze emails. But what they found, an interesting story that they found, is that there was an organization where they had computer developers or software developers, and they found that the people who were on the west side of the building were performing at a much higher level than the people who were on the east side of the building. And so they were looking at, what are the differentiators for those folks, and how can we normalize this and make elevate the performance of the folks who are on the east side. And so they looked at the data. They were looking at all sorts of different models and predictors, and what they found was that the way you entered the lunchroom, so if you entered from the west side or the east side, mattered. And they found that people who were entering from the west side sat at tables, because the west side of the cafeteria had tables with 12 tops or 12 seats available, and the east side only had 4 top tables. Now this, and so what they did as problem-solving mechanism was pushing the 4 top tables and making them 12 top tables to increase collaboration and conversations with people throughout their lunch period. And that elevated performance from the folks on the east side. The other thing that's interesting about Humanize is they've created this piece of software called the badge that people, or it's not a piece of software, sorry, it's a piece of hardware that people wear around them. It's called the badge. And the badge can track tone of conversation, distance between 2 people having a conversation. If one person shifts backwards, can capture bio data, heart rate, things of that nature. And so that's an application. I'm frankly not all that excited about that, but that is an application and a use for capturing data that will be used using artificial intelligence to help improve performance. So before we move on to the social trends, I just want to launch a poll question here, and I'm also checking on time, so I think we're doing pretty well on time. But which of these technologies do you find most exciting? And I'm going to ask, am I launching this poll, or is somebody on the other side? Somebody on the other side is. So if you want to take a moment and let us know which one you find most exciting, that would be fantastic. And Jackie, do you have any questions?
Yeah, Don, while that poll is being filled in, one comment just came through that said, hey, related to your hip replacement, my wife has a new printed shoulder, and that's from David.
That's amazing.
Yep. And then I just got another question. Is there a technology not on this list that you are following?
Yeah, a couple. So the one that, and thank you for the question, the one that I do find really fascinating is transportation. So we had a guest on who worked for NASA for quite some time and worked for Hyperloop. And I find the Hyperloop technology to be one that is very fascinating and interesting. But what she's doing, her name is Dr. Anita Sengupta, and she worked for NASA on the Mars Curiosity rover mission. So she designed the parachute. And she's designing this vertical takeoff. It functions like a helicopter, but it also flies like a plane. And they want to revolutionize the way urban travel is done. But she also talked about how she believes that in 10 to 20 years, we will put a human being on Mars. And so that's one of the topics. And the other one is Neuralink from Elon Musk. And there's going to be a big demo tomorrow on that technology. So I think we're done with the poll. And I'm not sure if we're sharing the results, but 31% said biotechnology, 21% said AI, and 23% said carbon capture. I tend to agree. I'm very excited about biotechnology, as long as we can get it right, as long as we're not violating people's ethics and we're using it for good. I think we could say the same thing for all of these different technologies. So we can move on and talk about the 6 social trends. So the first one we'll talk about is aging. And just to run a couple stats by you, there are 143 million people globally over the age of 80. And that's as of last year. That number will triple by 2050. This year, people over 65 outnumbered people under the age of 5 for the first time. And by the year 2100, almost 1 in 4 people will be 65 years or older. So think about that for a second. And population experts believe that we're going to flatten population growth at about 12 billion by the end of the century. So obviously there are a lot of implications to this, implications around an aging workforce and healthcare demands, later retirement. So people may know a guy by the name of Chris Farrell from NPR. He wrote a book called Purpose and a Paycheck, where he talked about how some people just want to work longer because it gives them meaning, but also need to work longer because they need the paycheck. Also later parenthood, which is interesting, and it was a product. We learned more about this in the interview with Hank Greeley. He said that with some of these biotech advances, it's possible that moms can be 50, 60, 70, or 80, even 80 years old when they give birth. Now, I don't know any 70-year-old women who would want to put themselves through that body, having seen it with my 4-year-old daughter and my 2-year-old daughter. That's doesn't seem like a pleasant experience, but it's a possibility. The aging population is also going to dramatically affect aging countries like Italy and Japan and even China. And obviously the United States is an aging country as well, but we've been able to mitigate that through immigration. Often people do want to move here and live here from other countries. So that's helped us combat some of these aging issues. Dr. Stephen Alstead is from University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's a biologist and he's been studying aging for decades. And he was talking about some really interesting and fascinating new drugs, not necessarily new drugs, but drugs that are being used for aging. Metformin is one example and rapamycin is another example. He believes that the average life expectancy will be 100 years and that the first human who will reach 150 years old has already been born. So that's a fascinating topic. On the other side, there's all sorts of work being done to extend life, but not necessarily improve quality of life. And so that will be a factor that we'll have to monitor. And that's something that aging experts will be focusing on as well. 60% of 18 to 34-year-olds say they use their cell phone excessively. And technology addiction is something that is real. I'm working with an organization that's focused on drug and alcohol addiction, but technology addiction will become more and more prevalent in this country, particularly when we continue to give these very, very powerful devices to 8 and 9 and 10-year-old children. We've not seen enough information, enough data on the effect that has on their brains. There's a great book called Irresistible by Adam Alter. I think it came out in 2017. He said the average millennial picks up his or her phone 150 times a day, and he believes that about 40% of people have some kind of internet-based addiction. I have a tile up there on the future of psychedelics. That episode hasn't come out yet, but there's amazing research being done on the use of psychedelics to combat smoking, drug and alcohol addiction, weight loss, trauma. About 70% of patients who come into one treatment facility I talk to have some sort of underlying trauma. So I think along with addiction and combating addiction, the use of psychedelics will be very much like the use of medical marijuana was 10, 15 years ago, where it was kind of on the fringe, and now it's become far more common today. The next one is immigration, which is really interesting. This trend will be driven largely from climate change, and it's going to increase and accelerate as sea levels rise and as droughts get worse or big storms get worse. So we'll see tens of millions of refugees over the coming years. And there are both opportunities for countries that do need to address aging and are willing to bring people in, but there are going to be crises, obviously, housing and treating people with dignity who are refugees. So incredible opportunities there. And this is one of those things that's kind of been put on the back burner with COVID-19, and we'll talk about that maybe in a minute or so. But this will be a huge trend that we'll be watching. This next one we're living out in real time, and you know, I'm downtown Minneapolis. I live downtown and I work downtown, and we were under lockdown again, a curfew last night in our city, which is awful. 500,000 people protested the death of George Floyd on June 6th across the country. Somewhere between 15 and 25 million people have participated in protests. And this is more than gender equity or racial equity. It has to do with education, access to healthcare, wealth. So just think about COVID testing, and if you've had a COVID test, how long it took you to get the results versus, let's say, an NBA player who's living in the bubble right now, and they can get their results back in 45 minutes. We're living in a very inequitable society, and we're seeing the ramifications of that and just how disruptive it is for us. Privacy is an episode that we just recorded with Carissa Velez. 62% of Americans do not believe it is possible to go through daily life without companies collecting data on them, and 63% say the same thing about the government collecting data on them. Amazingly, 79% of Americans say they're very or somewhat concerned about how companies are using their data. There's been new privacy legislation, the California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR in Europe, but these have no way of protecting people from new technologies that are being created and offered out there. And so in this, I was blown away by this interview. She talked about facial recognition being a new privacy violating technology, but also drones taking our temperature. Contact tracing, gait recognition, so how you walk can be traced back to you. The Pentagon has developed a laser that can identify people by their heartbeat and can identify them from 200 meters away. It's called Jetson. You can look it up. It's so frightening, super frightening to me. And to me, I don't really understand the benefit of it other than just surveilling on the population. The last social trend that we'll talk about here is trust. And we've talked about these new technologies and privacy and immigration and all of these other trends, and they do have an impact on the future of trust. And we interviewed Alvaro Marquez. He led this study called Trust 2030 with his company called Method and in conjunction with Hitachi. And what they found is that there are going to be three potential paths for how we trust. So we'll eventually end up in a decentralized and fully transparent environment, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable from a privacy perspective. A centralized and curated sense of trusting, where we allow a huge company to kind of make recommendations for us, what should we be eating, what should we be consuming, how we should be spending our time, which sounds way too big brother for me, or a distributed and autonomous future. So, which is the one I prefer, but when I took their survey, it wasn't the one that I got. But the distributed and autonomous would be more like communities growing their own food and producing their own energy, much more of a commune style. Trust 2030 is predicated on a big global event, dramatically changing the way we trust our environments, to trust our institutions, trust our companies. They predicated it on a global data breach, but I think we are going through it with COVID-19 right now. So it will be interesting to see how trust does morph over the coming years. I'm going to skip past the next poll question just so we can get to some questions and make sure that we end on time. And I will also recommend that if people are interested in futurist principles and practices, go research the Four Forces model. This is the model that Cecily Summers, who was a guest on the show, created. She says that the four forces, which are resources, technology, demographics, and governance, do not change, but the process through which they're introduced does change. So read up on the Four Forces model. I'm going to close just with a couple comments on how COVID has affected or is affecting these 12 trends. So I wrote the 12 trends article late last year. We published it early this year, and I've been working on this topic over the course of the past few months, pre-COVID and post-COVID. 1 in 6 Americans are expected to work from home permanently following COVID-19, and this will have huge influences. COVID will have huge influences on AR and VR adoption and on VR and AR investment. It's going to have a huge influence on biotechnology and on carbon emissions. We're actually benefiting a little bit, although it does seem like the world is coming back to life and we are commuting a little bit more and using our cars a little bit more. Traffic is picking up, but our environment did get a nice breather. And then it's going to have huge implications to trust, privacy, aging, immigration, addiction, inequality, all of those things. And I think you can probably understand why COVID is affecting the way we do trust and we view our privacy, etc. So with that, I'm just going to go to my last slide here and encourage people, if you have questions or you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you have some questions, shoot.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for a very provocative presentation. And as you can imagine, we've been getting quite a few chats. Actually, one is just related to what you just referenced. Is there a link to the article Don just mentioned? We can include that in the email we send out if you have that link.
Absolutely. It's posted on my LinkedIn profile, but I'm happy to share it with you. Absolutely.
That'd be great. All right. I'm going to hit a couple questions. How is the U.S. government involved in the development of these technologies, going back to the first 6 technology trends you presented?
I think in various ways. Obviously, I don't know all of the different ways, but for example, the privacy technology, Jetson, that is a government technology, and they are creating that. They're using artificial intelligence, data gathering, data mining in pretty significant and dramatic ways. They're not telling us all of the ways in which they're using it, and I can understand that. But yeah, and you know, the other thing is governance. So if you go back to that Four Forces model that I talked about, governance is the last piece, and governance can be an accelerator, but it also can be a barrier or an inhibitor. So think about regulation, and think about these topics. They're pretty broad categories, right? Biotechnology is a huge and broad category. Artificial intelligence is a huge and broad category. But governance and governments can be either an accelerator, so they can invest, they can encourage companies to use carbon sequestration or use carbon capture utilization or carbon utilization, or they can set up regulations. In the case of biotechnology, you're going to see regulations. You're going to see the government stepping in for some of these things.
Great, thank you for the answer. Another question that just came through, what can individuals do to prepare for the change these trends will bring?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a $1 million question. And I think from an individual perspective, what I find most important is to be curious and embrace the changes, because, you know, you can try to resist them, but that's not going to work. You're going to get run over, or worse, well, not worse. You could risk being obsolete, and nobody wants to be obsolete. And that's actually why I created 12 Geniuses. I wanted to explore these topics and share them with people so they can be prepared for these changes. So be open to them. Get some agility, build some agility and some resilience. You know, and you can do that and get yourself out of your comfort zone, because a lot of these things make me really uncomfortable, and I'm studying them. So they're probably making most people on this meeting uncomfortable as well. But I would say those things is embrace them, walk toward them, don't try to resist them, build some resilience, get out of your comfort zone, and do that on a regular basis. And then from an organization perspective, I think it's really important that we prepare people for these changes with ample time. Not 6 months before we're going to get disrupted by these changes, 3 years before. So we can train our people, and so they can be mentally ready for it, emotionally ready for it. You know, not everybody is emotionally ready to embrace these changes. And as leaders, we have to get our folks there.
Thank you. And like I say, I've got quite a few questions. I'm going to try to get through 2 more if that's okay.
Okay.
Do you see people withdrawing from certain sectors of technology to increase their privacy?
Yes, there are, but it's a fairly fringe activity, and it's very difficult to do. I know it's something that I would like to do. I personally would like to do, but it's just not practical in order to make a living. And so I will say that what probably will happen more is people will take technology holidays, not necessarily to protect themselves from a privacy perspective, but just to protect themselves from a mental well-being perspective. Because if we're always attached to our devices, that does wear on us. And so you know, people who have put their phone down for a week and just said, I'm out, I'm going into nature, they've come back more creative, more energized, so their well-being is accelerated or elevated. But I think it's going to be really difficult to combat some of these things. And I also am I'm not very optimistic that we have the leaders in Washington, and this is not in no way a liberal or conservative perspective, but I don't think we have the people who understand technology to regulate it. And we saw that with the Facebook when Mark Zuckerberg was called before Congress. They didn't really understand how this $750 billion company made their money. And so, you know, we will be very late in regulating some of these technologies around privacy.
Helpful, very helpful. This sounds like the perfect question to end on. Are you more optimistic or less optimistic about the current decade compared to the previous decade?
Well, based on our conversation here, I think most people would say that I'm less optimistic, but the truth is that I'm very, very optimistic. And the fact of the matter is, people will figure out how to use these technologies. People will adapt to these social trends. And if you look back 100 years, 120 years, life expectancy in the United States, I think, was around 54 years old, 55 years old, something like that. And it's in the mid 70s now, closer to 80. You know, we have fewer, I think, 1,300,000 people fewer living in abject poverty than we did in the 1990s. And so the world has gotten better in many, many ways, and technological advancement is, one of the main reasons for that. People have been lifted out of poverty, people have opportunity, people have access to education in the ways they never did before. So I'm way more optimistic, and sorry if I was a bit of a wet blanket. And these are some of the trends, but we'll have to figure out how to use them and how to embrace them and take advantage of them. And so yeah, let's be optimistic.
Sounds great. Well, Don, thank you for joining us for the capstone event on our Summer Online Learning Series. And I want to thank everyone who participated today and joined us this summer. I know it was a wild summer, and hopefully this brought some positive professional development through this crazy time. So look for our Summer Online Learning Series. That'll be coming out next week. We'll also be sending a link to this presentation as well as the video and the reference to the articles early next week. And thank you for joining us at the University of St. Thomas this summer. Be safe, be well, and I hope we see you this fall.